Here's a lovely image of the Don. This was a little image created by his alt-right disciples, I think. Anyway, let me just go straight into this. This is a comic from 1984. It's a story called What If Captain America Were Revived Today, published in 1984 from What If number 44. It's an alternative universe story that offered one of the starkest engagements with right-wing politics that's been an ongoing feature in Captain America comics since 1941. In this world, America has become a fascist state under a white supremacist senator who successfully runs for president. In the context of a white nationalist being elected president of the United States in 2016, What If number 44 takes on added significance, and I'll come back to this as we go along. While Captain America comics have consistently taken these particular strains of politics as a theme, they're also broader cultural explorations of national identity. Here I agree with Jason Dittmer, who argued that superheroes are not simply a reflection of a pre-established identity, but become a discourse through which the world becomes understandable. He says that because geopolitical orders are themselves stories, the relationship between representations of the nation and cultural artifacts like comics is co-constitutive. However, in the introduction to Nation and Narration, an earlier collection of essays on this topic by Homi Bhabha, he had already problematized this relationship, arguing that the narrative element introduces an ambivalence that haunts the idea of nation, destabilizing an idea that many hold to be true, certain, and incontrovertible. And contrary to what many people assume about Captain America, I think the character has been an ongoing exercise in this sort of conceptual indeterminacy, wavering between vocabularies, as Bhabha puts it, of familiar comfort and alien uncanny disturbance. Here I would argue that this ambivalence is played out through a form of doubling, as seen in the character's regular encounters with authoritarian, right-wing patriots or zealous versions of himself. This doubling activates the uncanny in the Freudian sense of something that belongs to two sets of ideas that are not necessarily contradictory. Both nation and patriot, especially in the American context, can speak to ideas of inclusion and exclusion, of law and violence, freedom and slavery simultaneously, and get to the heart of the struggle over what America means. And this is sort of where I've got with this talk so far. It's been through a number of iterations. It's got to this idea of doubling at the moment. So it's sort of half finished, right? It needs to be, we need to start from this position of the double, but I haven't had time to do that yet, but so we'll just go through as it is. So through battles with characters like Bad Cap, this is Bad Cap, and Super Patriot, and also characters like Nuke, and later Anti-Cap, the comics have tried to tie Captain America and the American nation to a narrative of liberal tolerance and multiculturalism, and thereby overcome the indeterminacy. More recently, however, and especially in response to the anabolic militarism of the Bush Doctrine and the war on terror, writers, I think, have explicitly started to accentuate the ambivalence and indeterminacy of the national icon with interesting political effect. This was most pronounced in Nick Spencer's use of retroactive continuity to tell a story in which Captain America is shown to have been a Hydra agent and therefore some variant of a fascist or a Nazi from the very beginning. I will contend that the Hydra Cap story was in keeping with the comic's criticism of zealous nationalism, but ask if the radical othering of the character ultimately bypasses the familiarity necessary to evoke the uncanny that haunts national identity and therefore fails as an attempt to engage with the rise of far-right sentiment in the US, signalled by the triumph of Donald Trump. I keep wanting to calling him Donald Triumph, but I'm not sure that works. Knowing what was happening in Europe, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America in 1941 as a piece of propaganda designed to encourage a reluctant American population and government to enter into World War II. The cover of the first issue is very famous for showing Captain America punching Hitler in the face. And over the years, in an echo of Simon and Kirby's own heritage as sons of Jewish immigrants, Steve Rogers' origin, that's Captain America's real name, has included his descendants from Irish immigrants, tying the symbol of American authority and virtue to the powerful story of the nation's openness to and care of refugees. This is a story, of course, that itself exposes a significant tension in narrating the idea of nation, a word that has its etymological roots in nativity and birth. Both these elements clearly construct the American nation as multicultural, cosmopolitan, and internationalist. What is less well recognised, though, is how US isolationism at the time of Captain America's creation included a strain of white nationalism that openly advocated support for German National Socialism and found the first issue of Captain America deeply offensive. As the writer of the character, Joe Simon, said in his memoir of those years, he says there was a substantial population of anti-war activists in the country. American Firsters and other non-interventionist groups were well organised. Then there was the German-American Bund. They were all over the place, heavily financed and effective in spewing their propaganda of hate. A fifth column of Americans following the Third Reich party line. Our irreverent treatment of their Führer infuriated them. We were inundated with a torrent of raging hate mail and vicious, obscene telephone calls. The theme was death to the Jews. So this is the context of the creation of the comic in 1941. From the beginning then, the comic has directly challenged Nazism, fascism and exclusionary nationalism and engaged the narrative indeterminacy that haunts American identity. The original run of the comic lasted 8 years but couldn't survive the downturn of interest in superheroes after the war. And the comic stopped in 1949 with Captain America seemingly dying in action. The comic was brought back in 1953 when Captain America returned as a commie smasher. But this was a failure lasting only 3 issues, fortunately. He resurfaced again, literally, in 1964 when Stan Lee brought him back in Avengers #4. Although he was still a soldier, this was what Philip Cunningham called a period of pacification for Captain America, in which he refrained from using guns and was written by Stan Lee as a man out of time and a New Deal Democrat with a deep sense of social justice. So the 40s, the New Deal in the 40s was what formed his political consciousness. So he has always been, since 1964, a New Deal Democrat. The problem then for Stan Lee's vision of Captain America was that the comic often needed to do important ideological work in support of a very belligerent foreign policy. And the patronym in his name regularly enabled crude nationalistic appropriation. The ease with which Captain America can be used to support the idea of the US as the world's saviour is clearly set out in Jewett and Lawrence's argument about what they call the Captain America complex and its role in valorising the redemptive violence of US foreign policy in a tireless battle of absolute good against absolute evil. So as the third iteration of the character became popular, writers had to find a way to establish his liberal and social democratic and indeed internationalist credentials. To do this, writers regularly pitted Captain America against arch nationalists in order to make it clear what he thought America meant. The first of these, as I've said, was Bad Cap, William Burnside. a man whose introduction was also used to explain the gap in the character's continuity and the appearance of Commie Smasher Captain America in 1953. Superhero universes abhor a gap in continuity, right? Like nature abhors a vacuum. They have to find a way of explaining what happened. So Bad Cap came back to try and explain the three issues of Captain America in 1953 and 4. So in Captain America issue 153 from 1972, Steve Englehart wrote a story in which a new Captain America appears while Steve Rogers is on vacation. This version is highly aggressive and racist, referring to Cap's black partner Sam Wilson as boy, and believes that Pinko, Steve Rogers, is weak, ineffectual, and ultimately unfit to carry on the fight against America's enemies, whom we find out in issue 155 are anyone who isn't pure-blooded American. When Steve Rogers stops him, it is explained he is a zealous imposter from the 1950s who tried to fill in for the national icon presumed dead, right? So remember, Cap's missing from about 47 to 64, so we have to sort of fill in. So as a patriotic fan of Steve Rogers, Burnside used plastic surgery to make himself look and sound like Steve Rogers and stole a batch of the super soldier serum that gave Steve Rogers his power. However, without the stabilizing supplement of the Vita Rays, the serum made him demonstrably insane. He was taken down and locked away in a special containment unit, only to be revived by a disgruntled patriot years later. This is when he reappears, okay, in 1972. So while this is a brilliant way to explain the gap in Captain America's story, it's also a simple tale in which zealotry, violence, prejudice, and racist myths of belonging are presented as alien to the proper construction of American nationhood, and are shown to be ideas of, in quotes, costumed bigots. However, the ambivalence around the idea of America was also very explicitly recognised in this arc, and this is what I like about it. In issue 156, Steve Rogers reflects on how the fight against William Burnside was really, really difficult. He says, "I've never had to fight the evil side of my own nature." Here, rather than Burnside simply dismissed for being that demonstrably insane madman, he's acknowledged as a dangerous element of national identity. By saying Bad Cap is actually part of him, Captain America articulates the dangers presented by the different narrative vocabularies available to national storytellers. In another story that began in 1987, Steve Rogers goes before a Senate commission and, concerned he's being used to act as a government stooge to fight America's proxy wars, he resigns. This is one of numerous times where Captain America makes an explicit distinction between the government that made him and the nation he now represents. This is also an excellent example of the way Marvel constantly negotiate competing visions of America. On the one hand, Steve Rogers expresses avowedly left-wing politics in his concern, and he actually says this, that he will be sent to fight with the Contras. Whereas his criticism of the commission rests clearly with a general suspicion of government on the political right. So Marvel constantly negotiate this path. While this is taking place, so while he's resigning, a terrorist, a sort of alt-right, I think, terrorist, known as Warhead, threatens to detonate a nuclear device in Washington if the government doesn't quickly go to war on somebody to strengthen national character. So Warhead basically says we need a war, right, to be strong. As Steve Rogers weighs up how he should act as the national symbol, in steps John Walker, also known as Super Patriot, who we've been introduced to a couple of issues before, to take down Warhead and quickly assume the vacant Captain America title. However, despite his passionate love for his country, Walker's dogmatic belief in America first, together with his own descent into a campaign of retribution and revenge, show him to be wholly unfit to assume the title. What's also interesting is that the character Super Patriot, or the name, first appeared in 1969 in an issue of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And in that first iteration of Super Patriot, he was explicitly presented as a racist who promoted anti-immigration. So for readers of Marvel Comics, this would have carried over into the new version. So another character that's used to differentiate Captain America's patriotism from obedient and zealous nationalism is Frank Simpson, also known as Nuke. Introduced by Frank Miller in Daredevil 232 in 1986. Nuke is an enhanced soldier. He's almost like a copy of Captain America. In some stories, he has had the same version of the super soldier serum that created Captain America. So Nuke is an enhanced soldier, but he's a product of a different war. Cap's the product of the good war of World War II. Nuke is the product of the bad war of Vietnam. He's pharmaceutically controlled to do the dirty work. You see at the bottom of here, he says, "Give me a red." Right? When he's jumping into action, he takes a red pill, and when they want to chill him out, they give him a blue pill. Right? So he represents the sort of the dirty work of US covert operations around the world. He's also a mercenary for hire, and as such represents the dark underbelly of American foreign policy. He's therefore despised by Captain America, but what Captain America really hates about him is the fact that he wears the flag, in Captain America's own words, because Nuke has actually had it tattooed onto his face. He's that much of an American. The need for another such character re-emerged almost 20 years later in 2004 during the War on Terror that supposedly required a no-compromise attitude from its national icon. In a story entitled Two Americas, which directly plays on the ambivalence I'm highlighting, Christopher Priest introduced Anti-Cap, whose name we never actually know. A new Captain America minus, as it says in the comic, the messy scruples and moral centre. He was engineered to obey orders without question. He was, as the comic says, a true believer. But his power, combined with his lack of conscience and a war that once again undermined America's symbolic authority, collapsed the distinction between hero and villain. And he too needs to be taken down by the proper Captain America. And when Captain America does this, in an especially ideologically recuperative moment, Anti-Cap's shield is broken to symbolise his legitimacy. I should note that this is probably some of the worst superhero art I've ever seen in my life. But I think it fits with that sort of anabolic militarism of the time of the war on terror. So in some senses, it's quite appropriate. So in light of Captain America's regular criticism of the dangers of crude nationalism and his defence of liberal multiculturalism, we might refer to him as a constitutional patriot. The greatest threat to this, of course, is fascism. Since Steve Rogers' return as Captain America in 1964, the comic has regularly set out the slippery slope between love of country as patriotism to exclusionary identity, nationalism, to persecutory violence, fascism or Nazism. Two of the most important stories in this regard have both involved bad Cap William Burnside. In Captain America 231, and this has a really odd echo of Charlottesville, Captain America 231, we're introduced to a neo-Nazi group known as National Force, whose leader, the Grand Director, is campaigning for strong national identity through racial purity and the purging of all non-whites. We later find out this is Burnside, whose own brand of zealous nationalism makes him susceptible to brainwashing by the Nazi Dr. Faustus, a psychologist who's got a very nice moustache and beard. However, by issue 234, Captain America also comes under the spell of the fascist psychiatrist. In this issue, we see Captain America chanting the name of National Force and brandishing his shield, now adorned with a swastika. Fortunately, he's freed from the spell in a fight with Daredevil, where the leaked contents of a barrel of oil act as a paint stripper to reveal his true shield beneath the fake. This vision of the star in place of the swastika is enough to break his trance and undermine this particular bid by Faustus to seize power. Back to What If 44, the comic with which I opened this discussion. Burnside here is not brainwashed by a Nazi. Rather, his zealous, discriminatory nationalism leads to the formation of a fascist state. In this timeline, Steve Rogers was not found in 1964, and a disgruntled patriot releases Burnside from his 1950s slumber to reinvigorate the nation. At this time, Quentin Hardiman, head of the Committee to Regain America's Principles, or CRAP for short, has thrown its support behind the white supremacist Norman Chadwick's campaign for Senate. After being successfully elected, he sets up the Federal Jobs Bureau and introduces anti-immigration identity cards that discriminate against minorities looking for work. Riots ensue and martial law is introduced. The newly created Sentinels of Liberty, who were the volunteers that Captain America asked the nation's young people to join in his very first issue in 1941, have now replaced the police and have become a sort of paramilitary security force. You see them up there. As unrest grows, the Harlem Wall is erected, right? A wall is erected around Harlem to keep all the black people behind it. When Steve Rogers is finally discovered, so he's not discovered in this story till 1984, he joins the resistance behind the wall and eventually confronts Bad Cap at a rally for Norman Chadwick's America First Party. I mean, the Trump kind of echoes here are quite incredible, especially given the last rally he was talking about nothing but his wall, was he? And shutting down the government and stuff. Anyway, so after the obligatory cap-on-cap battle, the victorious Steve Rogers makes yet another great Captain America speech. Possibly, I think, the most radical. He declares, America is nothing. Without its ideals, its commitment to the freedom of all men, America is a piece of trash. He then explains who he is and why he volunteered to fight the fascism that has now taken hold in 1980s America. He says, I fought Adolf Hitler not because America was great, but because it was fragile. And I would say that it's fragile precisely because America, despite the seeming power of its institutions, is merely an idea supported by stories. And different narrators have the power to bring about very different realities. In all of these stories, it's not just that America is positioned in opposition to fascism. The use of other patriotic figures and the susceptibility of Captain America himself to the influence, however briefly, of fascism is used to show the dangerous proximity of authoritarian and discriminatory violence to America's national icon. And that the nature of that icon is very much dependent upon the way the story of national identity is told. Enter Hydra Cap. After being stripped of his youth and powers by Arnim Zola, this is a couple of years back, who was a Nazi biochemist originally created by Jack Kirby in 1977, Steve Rogers is unable to continue as Captain America and hands over the title and his shield to Sam Wilson, who's been his partner as the Falcon since 1969. This was a significant moment because Sam Wilson is clearly black, but more importantly, he was the first ever specifically Afro-American superhero. When Nick Spencer took over the writing of Captain America in 2015, Sam Wilson's history as a one-time crook turned Harlem social worker who had strongly identified in the past with militant civil rights activism made him the perfect candidate to confront the racism, xenophobia, and white supremacism that Donald Trump's rise to prominence during the Republican primaries in that year signaled. In Spencer's first issue, and immediately working on the conceptual indeterminacy of what America means, Sam Wilson directly challenged Trump's agenda by traveling to the US-Mexico border, where he rescued illegal immigrants from a group of right-wing vigilantes known as the Sons of the Serpent, who were kidnapping them for use in genetic experiments. This is exactly at the time that Trump is talking about his wall, right, and Mexicans. The story, this is hilarious, the story immediately grabbed the attention of Fox News, who claimed Captain America's new enemy was conservatism. Spencer continued to write a politically topical comic, focusing primarily on issues motivating the Black Lives Matter movement, but it soon became apparent he had always planned the return of Steve Rogers to the role to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the character. This was a great shame in many ways. A black Captain America was an important component in Marvel's shift towards better representation in comics, and Sam Wilson, as the only Captain America at this time, would have been a powerful message about race in America. However, Steve Rogers returned and did so in a dramatic way when in the first issue of the new story, he was revealed to be a Hydra agent. And he had been all along, right from the, so he's like a sleeper agent. There was a mixed reaction with those thinking that this was a great story, but also those who thought his alignment with Marvel's fascist terror organisation made no sense in relation to the character's lifelong fight against Nazism, and also that it was an insult to his two Jewish creators. For me, this was a brave move, and actually this is my first and only ever attempt to use Photoshop, so I would like you to appreciate this. With the rise of Trump on a ticket of racism and xenophobia that was clearly giving legitimacy to white supremacy and America's own proto-Nazi movement that goes by the name of the alt-right, Spencer seemed to be saying that fascism was no longer alien or a threat emanating from some foreign field. It was now in the heart of the American body politic. Again, this was a powerful political use of the ambivalence that haunts the concept of America, born of a tension between narratives of identity and narratives of difference. The question remains, though, once Trump became president, how effective was this realignment of Captain America as a means of challenging Trump's deeply chauvinistic brand of nationalism? When Captain America said "Hail Hydra" at a time when Trump's white nationalist agenda carried an echo of the Grand Director's call for America to be purged, the comic was continuing a long tradition, I thought, of engagement with far-right politics. However, by the time the story was expanded into the Secret Empire event, the threat had become alien and foreign rather than domestic and familiar. In that event, as Captain America teamed up with a range of old fascists, including Baron Zemo, you can see a few of them up the top here, Baron Zemo, Arnim Zola, Madame Hydra, Gorgon, Kraken, Dr. Faustus and the Hive, to bring the Hydra plan for a perfect world to fruition, Captain America was now very clearly in the category of villain, and I think the familiarity required for the conceptual ambivalence around nation to do its political work was undone. So he also often appears out of Captain America costume and in his full kind of Supreme Leader Hydra outfit. In the process, however, there has been some very significant moments of serious political critique, I think, not least in the one-shot titled The Oath, in which Captain America takes over, this is Hydra Captain America, taking over as the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is sort of like Homeland Security in the Marvel Universe. And under emergency powers, he assumes executive control of the country and becomes de facto president. This issue was published in the very same week as Trump's inauguration, with the swearing in of the fascist Captain America made to look uncannily like the real inauguration that had just taken place in Washington. However, the story became problematic in that people were having debates over whether Hydra were actually fascists, nitpicking over terminology in the same way the alt-right were trying to pretend they weren't fascists. It was also the wrong time to give these people the Captain America they wanted. This is actually from Charlottesville. And these are members of the alt-right in Hydra T-shirts, right? So it's the wrong time to give these people the Captain America they wanted. An issue compounded by some disturbing iconography within the book itself, where Captain America raises aloft Thor's hammer, a popular symbol in the contemporary fascist manual, and he declares himself to be worthy, which is really deeply problematic. In these moments, Captain America is so radically othered that the political critique traditionally based on proximity to a recognisable identity loses its efficacy. The stories involving Bad Cap, Super Patriot, Nuke and Anti-Cap all articulate some avowed element of the American national myth, no matter how perverse. Hydra Cap, by contrast, has no connection to American nationalism, but is committed to a global authoritarian cult that predates even the Nazism he was created to fight. So to get back to the ambivalence that I think is important politically, I want to conclude with a couple of other stories. It's traditionally been the case that Captain America comics have articulated the uncanny only as a means of overcoming conceptual indeterminacy and ideologically tying the meaning of America to a particular vision of a Pacific liberal cosmopolitanism. Since the beginning of the War on Terror, however, writers have increasingly invoked the uncanny in order to allow it to do its disruptive work. This was most noticeable, I think, in John Reber's book called The New Deal that was published in 2002. So remember, this is a year after the attacks in New York and Washington, right? It starts in familiar territory, and also you'll notice that extremely sort of fascistic iconography. It's probably one of the most fascistic covers you'll find for Captain America, but it's intentionally so. So the story starts with box cutters on a plane and Al-Qaeda celebrating before switching to the scene at Ground Zero, and Captain America lamenting the fact that he wasn't there. We then follow him on his walk home and seeing him stopping a revenge attack on a born and bred New York Muslim. When we first see Captain America in uniform in this story, the narrative is still speaking to us about hunting down the terrorists responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And yet the image is of him stopping a white American killing a Muslim American, thereby immediately evoking different vocabularies and two sets of ideas around America as a nation. At this point, however, we're still in the familiar ideological territory where the uncanny was sort of momentarily engaged, only for it to be hidden again and contribute to a very clear statement about liberal, tolerant, multicultural America. But this is not where the issue or the story ends. It suddenly jumps 7 months into the future, where we are told a terrorist attack on the American town of Centerville. You couldn't have a more kind of, central town than Centerville. And Captain America is called in to respond. As he is deployed from a Shield helicopter, Nick Fury, in this panel here, tells him that the terrorist leader he's going in to face, Al-Tariq, is a monster. To which Captain America simply replies, "So am I," as he jumps out of the plane. The indeterminacy created in this mirroring effect is repeated when Captain America first engages the terrorists. He slowly discovers that he's actually fighting a group of youths who all have artificial limbs because their hands and feet have been taken by US landmines and cluster bombs. So the violence of these supposed terrorists stems directly from America's own actions on foreign fields that has now come back to haunt it. So it's quite a disturbing confrontation. It's sort of Captain America confronting his own foreign policy, or the foreign policy of his own nation. Even more stark is Steve Rogers' reflection in issue 5 on the World War III rhetoric that he's hearing all around him. When he explains why he's fighting in this particular fight against terrorism, he says the first word he says is Dresden. As a World War II veteran, the 9/11 attack has made him re-evaluate the bombing that killed anywhere between 35 and 100,000 civilians on that fateful night in, was it 1944? 45? In something of a recuperative moment, he declares he's fighting for people and for peace. But this cannot overcome the uncanny sense that America is complicit in and guilty of acts of violence far in excess of those it currently condemns. However, while this is a good example, there's numerous others, but I can't use them all. While this is a good example of using the indeterminacy that haunts the narration of nation, it was perhaps most effectively and disturbingly presented in a story called Ultimate Captain America, a 4-part story by Jason Aaron set in the alternative Marvel Ultimate Universe. So in 2000, Marvel rebooted its universe to try and help new readers to find a way in, right? So they had their regular universe and they had the Ultimate Universe, and they sort of reworked the characters and retold the stories. So this is a four-part story in that universe. Taking his lead from the portrayal of a more belligerent and jingoistic Captain America that was presented by Mark Millar in his Ultimate Universe take on the Avengers from 2002, which is another great sort of doubling example, Aaron depicts Captain America, a Captain America that is far more nationalistic and whose patriotism is unreflexive and uncritical, unlike the Captain America of the regular universe. This different status is shown through Ultimate Cap using guns and killing people. Since his period of pacification, one of the most powerful ideological disavowals in the comic has been Captain America's refusal to use a gun. Instead, and in a perverse articulation of the ambivalence around this subject, it is his young sidekick Bucky who acts as his proxy and does all the killing, allowing Captain America to retain his veneer of only using defensive non-lethal violence. In Ultimate Captain America, however, this duplicity is done away with, but the violence of American foreign policy becomes the explicit subject of the book. In an echo of Apocalypse Now, Captain America has been sent to track down our friend Nuke, who's gone AWOL. In doing so, Captain America is captured by Nuke's group of newfound disciples in the jungle, and the comic opens at the point where Nuke is about to execute him. On his knees, Captain America starts to pray. Nuke hears this and mocks him, deciding to leave him in his cell for a further 5 minutes to see if Cap's God will come and save him. In the meantime, the book takes us on a lengthy flashback through Nuke's own epiphany about the nature of the violence he's been asked to perpetrate. And this then goes back to the point prior to this execution scene where he attempts to re-educate Captain America about the true horrors of American foreign policy. In this Ultimate Universe, like in the What If story, Captain America was lost for a lot longer, so he's not aware of Korea, Vietnam, and all these other places. So to fill him in, Nuke starts to teach him about Nixon and US actions in Indonesia, Laos, and Chile, amongst other places. In issue 3, we also see Nuke treating Cap to some of the latest techniques of enhanced interrogation. Nearly drowning him, Nuke says, "Just keep telling yourself waterboarding isn't torture." At the end of the issue, when the story returns to Cap in his cell, we hear him pray and ask God to show him there was a purpose to his mission. At which point, we are told, he suddenly sees the hand of God. And at this point, I'm feeling quite nauseous when I'm reading this book, because Cap's not particularly religious in this sense, right? And he's certainly not this nationalistic. So I'm feeling quite ill. I don't know where this story's going. So anyway, he suddenly declares he sees the hand of God. In issue 4, this is explained. We see that a cobra has suddenly appeared in the corner of his cell. And Cap kills the snake. He literally sort of bites its head off and sucks all the poison out of it, and uses that poison to overpower Nuke when Nuke comes back to execute him. And after a lengthy fight, Cap takes him down, and he's arrested by S.H.I.E.L.D. I've just put that in there because it's a great image, right? So he defeats Nuke, and S.H.I.E.L.D. come and arrest him. Cap returns home back to New York, and he's shown relaxing with a fellow Avenger, Hawkeye. And Cap explains, and this is his words, "God wasn't done with me, so he sent down a miracle and saved me." To which Hawkeye reminds Cap that snakes aren't really the big guy's style. That's Hawkeye's words. And asks him how he knows it wasn't the work of the devil. The book then closes with Cap denying the possibility that his mission is anything but good, and having refused to hear the truth from Nuke, he sits next to the now restrained prisoner and reads him the Bible, seemingly to reaffirm his and America's manifest destiny. And this is where the story finishes, in this kind of scene of complete denial, with Cap teaching him about the true Christian mission of America, having rejected the idea that this is the work of the devil. As I've said, I've yet to read a more disturbing Captain America comic, or one that better evokes the uncanny ambivalence, indeterminacy and wavering vocabularies that haunt the narration of Nation. And it does this precisely because it makes the familiar strange. In the end, Ultimate Captain America works through the production of what Freud called the uncanny double. Not only do Captain America and Nuke mirror each other as images of patriotic soldiers, but this mirroring inverts both characters as they have been used in earlier stories. And the indeterminacy of the snake as hand of God or work of the devil exemplifies this slippage. So Cap's struggle will, of course, go on, as will the struggle over how to tell the story of the nation. And with that, I'll finish, and you can ask me some questions if you would like.